Recording started. All right, we're going. So, tonight, before I start, I just had dinner with this friend of mine, Daniel Aaron Harris. I just want to give a shout out to this guy. I had to like say, hey, goodbye. I need you to leave. I'm gonna go do this live session. Um, but Daniel has this. He's an amazingly gifted artist. He does children's books, and I'm gonna put the link to a couple of his children's books in the chat, and I'll put them on YouTube. Um, I don't know. I love this guy and I love what he's about. He's an artist with cerebral palsy, and I think it's good for us as X-ray techs to connect with people from all different abilities and all different backgrounds and understand who they are, where they're coming from. And so I just put a couple of books by Daniel in the chat, just as really just to encourage y'all to engage with diverse patient populations, and also just to give a shout out to him. So as we get into the material, I have to give you this disclaimer by the ART. Basically, nothing that I'm saying is endorsed by them. So as I talk about the American Registry of Radiologic Technologists or anything related to them, just know that I'm in no way affiliated with them, and I'm not offering you any insider information. I'm really not discussing anything that isn't like out there that's public knowledge. I'm just giving kind of my perspective on it. And you may be wondering, well, why does my perspective matter? Like, what are my qualifications? Well, I've written a ton of books about the ART, and probably in terms of registry mastery, I know a lot of us go to the Rock the Registry books, and I hope to have another book come out, volume 2 of registry questions. I was really shooting for September. It's not going to happen, but October is kind of drop dead deadline for that. So volume 2 of Rock the Registry is coming out, but I would encourage you to look at the Golden Formulas book, which is free. If you can't figure out where it lives online, just email me and I'll get you a copy of it. But also 2 Months to Mastery. I feel like those two books are, for the books that I've done, those are the most that kind of like pull the curtain back and say, hey, this is how the registry works, and here's how best to kind of prepare yourself for it. But that's exactly what we're trying to do tonight. And in order to do that, I just want to repeat the purpose of the registry exam. And I'm going to be speaking primarily to people who are taking the X-ray registry exam. If there's anyone here who's taking something other than the radiography exam, put that in the chat now. Like if you're taking, I don't know, the nuke med or radiation therapy or something like that, put it in the chat now. Otherwise, I'm going to direct most of my comments towards X-ray technology. X-ray technology is a primary exam, and the ART has said that the purpose of these registry certification exams is to assess the knowledge and cognitive skills underlying the intelligent performance of the tasks typically required of the staff technologist at entry into the profession. And I've underscored entry into the profession. That underscore is mine, because I want to emphasize basically what they're trying to ask you questions about is like stuff you need to know your first day on the job. So as an X-ray tech, what do you need to know your first day on the job? So I just find that encouraging to know that like they're not trying to get lost in the weeds of something. So for the objectives that I've kind of thought about for tonight, I've literally just pulled these right from the ARRT content specifications. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to Google ARRT content specifications for, it'd be like radiography. But if you Google that, it should pop up and you'll get this really important PDF that talks about how the exam is broken down. And for the procedures section of the registry is still the largest section of the exam. Out of the 200 questions, 66 of them come from procedures. So just over 25% of the exam is procedures questions. And they are gracious in further breaking down the number of questions to 18 questions on the head, spine, and pelvis, 20 questions on thorax and abdomen, and 28 questions on extremities. And I want to point out too, if you scroll through the document, with procedures studying, pay close attention to attachments A and B. And I'll talk about B in just a moment. But a lot of what I'm talking about tonight basically streams from some of the thinking that I've done about attachment A. This is not going to be an exhaustive presentation. I don't think there's any way I could cover um, all that goes into the procedures part of the test in like less than an hour. I think that would be crazy to even attempt. But what I want to do is talk about some dirty mnemonics. So that's why I've got the parental advisory on this for us tonight. I, I think the mnemonics helped me. They've helped me through the years, and for whatever reason, the dirtier the better. So you've been advised that some of the content tonight is a little blue. So the first thing we should talk about is anatomic position. What anatomic position is, because the ART assumes a very specific definition around the word position, right? And they are assuming, in most cases, the anatomic position, which is these two naked individuals are demonstrating for us. So the way I would describe this is the hands are supine or supinated. They're resting on the plantar surface of the foot, and the neck is extended. So all of those terms, supine, plantar, neck extended, these are positioning terms. I'm just curious, like, what other positioning terms can y'all think of? I know there's a ton. Just put them in the chat. Give me a few more positioning terms. I'm going to differentiate this from something else because this is going to be important. There's two P words. Good. Prone is definitely a positioning term. Good work. So supine, prone. I always heard like supine versus prone, like supine, like the soup is in my hand. I don't know, that's stupid, but I just imagine like the soup being poured out of my hands as I flip my hands over. Um, Give me at least one other. There's one that I feel like is real tricky, particularly for old school techs like me. And I want to talk about why it's tricky in just a moment. But what's okay, good, erect. Perfect. Um, Another one I think is tricky is lateral. Lateral is considered a positioning term, but if you look at like old versions of Merrill's, it will use it as both a positioning term and a projection. And that the ART wants to say, no, we need to be really precise about this. So in your mind, you need to have two separate files. Files for anatomic positioning for positioning of the patient, and then a separate file for projections. So the projections that, as I've looked at current registry documents and continue to kind of go back through Merrill's has been my primary text on this. The projections that I've identified are anterior, posterior, posterior, anterior, PA, axial, and tangential. So if we see any other term other than that, it's probably a positioning term. So the way that the anatomy is positioned versus the projection being the path of the central ray through the anatomy. You can see why lateral would be kind of confusing. So have that in the back of your mind, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about in terms of mnemonics, we're going to need to kind of go back to proper anatomic position for some of these mnemonics and other kind of visual aids to work. So for the head, this is the way they've broken down the head, 18 questions on these areas. I'm going to be really honest with you. Nasal bones, there's not a whole lot they can ask you about that. And TMJ is kind of the same. Mandible, I think you're good if you know your mandibular anatomy, but there are some wonky projections of the mandible. There's some wonky procedures that we do for the mandible, so that there's definitely high yield. Lots of questions can come out of the mandible. Lots of questions can come out of the facial bones, the sinuses, and the skull. So what I'm talking about when I say high yield, I mean that as an exam writer, this and these all present parts of the skull where the questions are very easy to answer or very easy to write and produce. So they're kind of the low-hanging fruit of the exam writer. These areas here, like especially nasal bones, I mean, what am I going to say about nasal bones? There's not a lot. You take a lateral projection and it's broken or it isn't, or hear what I said, a lateral position and it's broken or it isn't. Mandible, you do have some interesting stuff. TMJs, though, I wouldn't be surprised if they get rid of that at some point in time. And we're going to look at orbits here in just a minute, because the main thing they can ask you about orbits is just skeletal anatomy. So as we kind of think more like a test maker, we can kind of identify those areas that are kind of high yield, those areas which we would most likely see questions about. So for the skull bones, Florida Patrol offers tickets so easily. So this is just a mnemonic for memorizing the bones of the skull, right? Frontal, 2 parietals, occipital, 2 temporals, sphenoid, and ethmoid. So just Florida Patrol offers tickets so easily for all the basically cranium bones. I thought that this was honestly probably one of the more tamer mnemonics, but I think it's a helpful mnemonic just for remembering, because again, another thing. So in thinking about what's high yield here, right? There's only so many questions I can ask you about these types of things. They like the sphenoid. Why? Because it articulates with a lot of other bones, right? So sphenoidal articulations, right? They like the ethmoid because it's kind of hidden down in there. These are the ones that seem fairly obvious, right? Frontal bone also has a sinus in it. So there's some additional stuff we can kind of think about with this. But yeah. All right, let's move on though. Also, I like this. Maybe this is an easier to memorize mnemonic for you. I don't know. I'd be curious which one you like, Florida Patrol or Old People from Texas Eat Spiders. I feel like old people from Texas Eat Spiders, it just kind of it gels with me more. The thing I like about the Florida Patrol offers tickets so easily is for whatever reason, as I navigate through the skull bones, that's the direction I kind of move through the skull bones. So as I visualize the skull bones, I work that way, versus this one, it seems to be kind of jumping all over the map. It's like, because we're going from the occipital bone to the parietal bones to the frontal bone and then back down to the temporal bone. So it just seems to be like bouncing all over the place in terms of the anatomy. I'm a pretty visual, like I visualize stuff a lot, and that's one of the reasons I like mnemonics. Um, but I I also like words. And so 14 to the face, this is an old military one. Like 14, like you imagine someone's punching you in the face like 14 times in the face. Um, that's very visceral, and I can remember that, but it just helps me remember there's 14 facial bones. And these are so some of these, it's like I was driving down the road this morning and I was trying to remember the 14 facial bones, and I couldn't. Like I missed at least 4, maybe 5. Because I did not remember the turbinates or the inferior conchae. I did not remember the vomer, and I did not remember the palatine. So but never make zebra make love prior to vasectomy. I like this one, again, because it's going nasal bones, maxilla, zygoma. So those are all like fairly close to each other, down to the mandible, lacrimal, palatine, turbinates, and vomer. All of this seems to flow for me. So never make zebra make love prior to vasectomy. Of course, it's very coarse, but that's kind of what we're looking for in mnemonics in order to jar our memory. Okay, orbit bones. This one might be the most offensive one that I've got. I can't remember. But eating McDonald's makes fat, sassy people lazy. Incredibly offensive statement, but it's got all of the orbit bones in there, which these are incredibly difficult to remember, like what bones of the facial, and then remember that there's some cranial bones that are in there as well. So ethmoid, maxilla, malar, zygoma in this case, frontal, sphenoid, palatine, and lacrimal make up the bones of the orbits. And honestly, with this mnemonic, I cannot, unless they throw in like a positioning thing for the orbits. The easiest question, right, for the orbits is like, which of these is the bone of the orbits, right? That's definitely the easiest orbit question. So I feel like if you just remember this stupid mnemonic, you're well on your way to, like, if they throw an orbits question on you again, we've got 18 total questions they can throw at us about these. I promise you, not all 18 of them are going to be orbit bone questions, because again, that's not the easy question to write, and they don't need you to just know about orbit bones. So I'm anticipating maybe one question would be on your exam about orbit bones, and the easiest question to write would be just asking you to name the bones. Additionally, when we memorize bony anatomy and we really start to dig into being comfortable with the way the different bones look, and where they articulate and what sorts of joints they have, we can start to line up radiographic positions in our mind. So these mnemonics will work for you to basically start to get more grounded in the anatomy, the skeletal anatomy you'll need for various projections. And honestly, more than like just like binging reading Merrill's, which who can do that? Or it's like just get out like 3D4 Medical's skeletal app and just get really familiar with the bones. And as you get familiar with the bones, you can visualize the projections, and you know like what the angles should be. Okay, moving along in the exam, we've got head, spine, pelvis. So the other subsection of this is spine and pelvis. So of those 18 questions, of which maybe one would be orbit bones, right? There's a lot that I could ask you about the spine and the pelvis, right, for this section of the exam. So in most technologists, if we're honest, we're a lot more comfortable thinking about CT and L spines than we are thinking about skull stuff. Why? Because a lot of skull stuff gets done by CT now, and the ART understands that. So I like this little mnemonic for spine anatomy, just remembering like how many vertebrae in the various parts of the spine. You know, because it's one of those things, it's like one of those you'd never forget. But it's like when you're in the middle of the exam and you're like all this random stuff's being thrown at you, it's like sometimes you just like you forget the basics. And so crunchy breakfast at 7, tasty lunch at 12, late dinner at 5, for CT and L spine, numbers of vertebra. I don't know, it's a silly one, but I'll throw it out there. Okay. For the thorax and abdomen, 20 questions on thorax and abdomen. And if you ask me, this is a much higher yield section of the exam. There's a ton that we could be asked about ribs. There's a ton that we could be asked about the chest and the sternum. There's not quite so much that we can really ask you about the sternoclav joints, right? Like, I don't even know if I would study those personally. Soft tissue neck, I mean, what can we say about it? But chest, ribs, sternum, that's important stuff, and it's kind of the bread and butter of our work, especially the PA and lateral chest x-ray exams. So here's how I orient myself around thoracic anatomy. Hand over your heart, right? And you just always remember that the heart is on the left side. So if you put your hand over your heart's on the left side. That means that because the heart's projecting into the left lung only has the 2 lobes. The right lung is the larger lung with 3 lobes, and the right main bronchus is larger. And so knowing that is really helpful, because you'll get patient care questions about foreign bodies and where will they lodge, or one question I've seen is like, which side in the chest most commonly has lung blockages due to like having a chest tube advance too far or something like that, or an ET tube advance too far. Again, right main bronchus, remembering that right side's larger. So hand over your heart. And if I remember that the hand is over my heart, my elbow's over the liver, right? So the liver is again on the right side, right? It's the largest organ in the abdomen. And so it's going to push down on all that abdominal anatomy. So the right kidney is going to be more inferior than the left. And when we get to, in just a minute, when we start talking about tallest building stuff, again, why is the splenic flexure the tallest building? And just file that away for a second. Again, it's because elbow over the liver, because the liver's on that right-hand side and it's pushing everything else down. So that hepatic flexure is more inferior than the splenic flexure. So so within that, so I'm guessing about 10 questions. I mean, if they just divvy it up evenly, you've got 10 questions on the thorax, 10 questions on the abdomen, and included within that abdomen, we've got the GI series, we've got contrast enema, surgical cholangiography and stuff like that. Those are the ones that students really seem to kind of freak out about, like single and double contrast around the GI studies. I'm going to show you a little mnemonic that helps me with that in just a moment. And I would be curious to see what other mnemonics people have learned. So if you have one, put it in the comments or put it in the chat. So here's a quick way of remembering how the gallbladder is situated compared to body habitus. There's like a lengthy discussion about this in Merrill's volume 3, I think. So tall and thin, down and in, short and stout, up and out. So if you have a person with a asthenic or asthenic body habitus, right, they are tall and thin, that gallbladder is going to be more inferior and more like midline, right? Versus if they are short and stout, the gallbladder is going to be more superior and moved more lateral, right? And that's really the case. So especially on surgical procedures like cholangiography, that's really helpful to remember. Just a good rule of thumb for day-to-day work as a tech. But they do ask questions about body habitus as it relates to gallbladder. Tallest building. So the tallest building is a little way that I have of orienting myself within the abdomen. If I'm thinking about barium or if I'm thinking about dual contrast types of procedures. So anytime you ever go to a big city like Chicago, for example, it's helpful to identify the Sears Tower. Why? Because it's so tall. And if you can locate where the Sears Tower is, you can kind of figure out where you are in relationship to it. So the same is true as we're looking at the abdomen. If we remember that for our dual contrast barium enema or whatever, that the splenic flexure goes the most superior, it's the tallest building in the abdomen, we can kind of figure out, okay, is this patient LAO or RAO or RPO or LPO? Like, how are they oriented right now? So we can start to think about that. And we can, if we just keep that tallest building in our mind, we can remember kind of how everything else should be rotating. I find that really helpful, just a simplification tool. Here's another simplification tool. So you remember putting the hand over your heart for remembering stuff about thoracic anatomy and abdominal anatomy related to the liver. The left hand rule is really helpful with the stomach. So I don't have some really great rules for remembering where the contrast is. I really racked my brains over the past month trying to think about something to call to mind, like if the patient is laying on their left side or whatever. I mean, I would just go back to like, where's the contrast in the descending colon or whatever. I would definitely go back to hand over heart and remember elbows over the liver. And I would start to think about the large intestine from there, right? So I know that the right side of the body is where I have like the ascending colon and cecum, and then the hepatic flexure, transverse colon, splenic flexure down to the descending colon. And I could orient myself, okay, if they're laying on their left side, then that descending colon is down or whatever, so the barium would be on that lateral portion like that. I would just have to basically go through the city, as it were, remembering the tallest building. But the left hand rule is really, really helpful. It basically will tell you any question you might have about barium in the stomach, right? So what you do is you hold your left hand up. And to really do this right, you have to have the fingers kind of hyper extended to where they're like kind of tilting backwards, as it were. And you hold that up in front of you. And you have now a perfect working model of your stomach, right? So they tell you can't bring stuff in the exam room. Well, guess what? You can bring your anatomy into the testing center, and you can use your anatomy as mnemonics. You can palpate your elbow or whatever to figure out where you're going. But the left hand rule, so imagine that this is your stomach. You've got the lesser curvature, you've got the greater curvature, you've got oh, that's good. I'm going to talk about that in just a sec, Marlene. I've got the fundus up here. That's my fingers. My fingers are the fundus, right? And duodenum here is my thumb. So duodenum, thumb, right? So if I've got barium in the stomach, right, and the patient is laying supine, right, the barium is going to be in the fundus, right? It's going to be in the fingers, right? Versus if they are laying prone, the barium's going to be down here in the body of the stomach. So this is a super helpful little way of thinking about the stomach and where barium would be as the patient's being moved around for like a small bowel follow through or whatever. Marley just put in the chat, you can lay on your back and you see the clouds, supine, barium. That's good. Not sure if that helps. I like that. Thank you. That's good. All right. So okay, I really racked my brain on this one. Uh, I don't know. I would just say know your kidney anatomy. Yeah, that's, I mean, basic function of the kidneys and kidney anatomy for this part. Okay, moving along to extremities. For upper extremities, we're talking about fingers, wrists, hands, forearm, elbow, shoulder, scapula, clavicle, and AC joints. I love this next mnemonic. I think it's probably my favorite one. So you've probably heard of a number of different versions that help you remember the wrist bones. I'm going to throw my hat into the circle for some lovers try positions that they cannot handle. I just can't get it out of my head. It's awful. But there's some other cool stuff in here in this mnemonic. So if you notice, so I always think about lunate, like you're love struck, you know, like the moon, you know, you're moonstruck. Triquetrium and tri, it's like, I mean, you can't get any closer. It's like some lovers try triquetrium. That's great. And then that they cannot handle. So I always think about when I get to the trapezium, right? The whole reason that this is so dumb, but the whole reason that humans can swing on trapezes is because they have a thumb, right? So trapezium goes with the thumb. So this mnemonic also tells me when I'm moving to the more distal row of carpal bones, because I've got scaphoid, lunate, triquetrium, pisiform are the more proximal carpal bones, and the more distal carpal bones begin with the trapezium, right? Trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. So if I'm in true anatomic position, this mnemonic is telling me I'm moving from lateral to medial, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrium, pisiform, and then again going to the distal row and going again lateral to medial. That's pretty slick. So trapezium goes with the thumb, and that's rad. And what's so great about that, we used to say this back in the 80s, is that's the radius side of the arm. So I also, in this mnemonic, I can remember that the radius is on the lateral side in anatomic position. So hopefully you got all that. I feel like this is probably my favorite mnemonic. I can't, you get so much out of it. So I'm learning location of the carpal bones. It's telling me which carpal bone articulates with the thumb, with the first metatarsal bone or metacarpal bone, and it's also telling me which side is the radius on. And I don't know, I love it. I think it's great. Okay, lower extremity stuff. So for the lower extremity, you've got toes, foot, calcaneus, ankle, tib, fib, knee, patella, femur, and long bone. So you'll notice for extremities, there's a lot here, right? And that's why I think it's so important for us to, like, for this area, we really do need to dig down and memorize all of our projections, memorize all of our angles, all of our central locations. But again, I just want to ground us in some anatomy to begin with. But for the foot bones, chubby, twisted, never could cha-cha-cha. So we got calcaneus, talus, navicular, cuboid, and three cuneiforms. And again, I like this mnemonic because it's going basically from proximal to distal, right? So it's chubby, twisted, never could cha-cha-chas, basically telling me the direction that I'm encountering these bones. I found one mnemonic for projections of the foot. 10 foot tall and 15 toes. This just reminds me that for the AP projection, or what do you call it? The dorsoplantar projection of the foot, you want an angle of 10 if you're doing the foot, and you want an angle of 15 if you're doing the toes, to account for how the anatomy is situated. I've got just a few more of those types of things, but I've saved those for a different discussion, just because I kind of wanted to get the potentially offensive material in one kind of lesson for any. I don't want to offend anyone or whatever. And I know some of this stuff is a little ridiculous. So come back if you're interested in like ways to remember, for example, Caldwell looking down the well, you know, that kind of stuff. We'll talk about all of that at a different time. Oh, the other extremity thing is like bone age, bone survey, arthrography. I mean, I'd be curious to know how many people here have actually assisted with an arthrogram. I know they're still doing them, but it's getting increasingly rare. I feel like MRI is kind of making that obsolete. But yeah, these are included in the extremity stuff. So expect to see at least one question about one of these things. Okay, good. Yeah, Haley, and I had a surgical hospital I worked at where we did arthrograms all day long. So it's like it's either you do a lot or you don't do any. Um, they are fun. They're fun to assist on. Okay, let's do some questions. Let's get to some questions and we can test our learning. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's generally how it's done, is like inject in the joint space with some gadolinium and send them off to MRI. Okay, so for this question, I'll read the question out loud. Where in the stomach is the barium located when the patient is in the left posterior oblique position, AP projection? Get out that left-hand rule. If you're feeling brave, put it in the chat. This is a zero judgment zone. But I intentionally did this so you can see how the left-hand rule works. Good. Yeah. It would be in the fundus according to the left-hand rule. So AP projection demonstrates barium-filled fundus when imaging the GI tract. So again, how am I using the left-hand rule with this, right? So I'm imagining I put up my left hand, I've got my fingers hyperextended to where they're kind of actually pointed more posterior in relationship to my body. And I'm literally in my mind laying myself down. And when I took my registry exam, I was like moving all over the place, right? So I'm laying down, I'm rotating to my left, right? And I'm imagining a central ray coming down this way. The barium would definitely be in the fundus. So I got really embodied. So once I knew the mnemonics and could kind of visualize this stuff, it helped. All right, let's do another one. What term is best thought of as a patient position? Anyone else agree with Marley? You are correct. It is B. Supine is a position. All the others, tangential, axial, anterior, posterior, these are related to projections. And one thing I should point out, because the CT tech in me always thinks axial. Oh, axial imaging. No, it means in the plane of the axial skeleton, right? So X-ray has their own special definition of what axial means, and it is a projection, basically angled in the plane of the axial skeleton, if that makes any sense. The supine would be the only patient position. I should stress, though, basically, there's a lot more positioning terms. There's a lot more positioning terminology than there is projections. So we can thank the ARRT for that they've simplified the projection terms to AP, PA, axial, and tangential. Did you say tangential or tangential? I don't know. All right. Okay. And we'll get more to these kinds of questions in the next time we meet up. So if this was what you were wanting from the session, just know we are going to get to this kind of stuff. But where should the central ray be directed for a PA projection of the hand? Good. I'm seeing a bunch of B's. B is correct. The third metacarpal phalangeal joint. So here, the reason I included this question in tonight's discussion is I've spent a lot of time talking about skeletal anatomy and mnemonics that have helped me memorize, well, some soft tissue structures like location of the liver, location of the heart, splenic flexure. But with some levers tripositions that they cannot handle, triquetrum goes with the thumb. Chubby could never twist, could only cha-cha-cha, or could cha-cha-cha. Those types of mnemonics, right, are helping me imagine the bony anatomy. And I mentioned earlier that if I know my bony anatomy, I can probably answer a lot of other questions. This is a great example of the kind of question that if I know some of bony anatomy and I know kind of what's being asked for, I could probably make a pretty good guess on this question. Because like if you think about it, like if I just hold up my hand, right? What is in the center as I look at this? It is the third MCP, right? So this is asking me, basically all the question's saying is, what is at the center of the picture, right? What is at the center of the picture? Hold up the bony anatomy, third MCP. So as I'm palpating my body and imagining things like for a lateral elbow, and we'll talk more about this in the future, like lateral knee, lateral ankle, all of these, and again, extremities are 28 questions, right, of the 66. So almost half the questions are upper and lower extremity questions, which I can palpate. I can palpate my upper and lower extremities, maybe not parts of my lower extremities, but I can palpate most of those extremities and orient myself pretty quickly and answer most questions, even if I didn't memorize something. If I know the bony anatomy, I can make really educated guesses. And you may be thinking, well, like, how good could you guess? And the reality is, the questions, the way that you're going to be like, so say the questions like, what amount of angulation is used for an oblique mortise view of the ankle, right? That might be something you need to memorize, right? So maybe you can't visualize the mortise joint, and you can't imagine like the rotation required. So maybe you should just memorize that. But the reality is like they're going to make the answers wildly different, right? So like the potential answers are going to be like 60 degrees, which like no one would ever do. Like 45 degrees, like maybe like 15 degrees and 5 degrees. Like they're going to make the degree separation really wildly. It's not going to be like 10, 15, 20, 25. They would never do that. Does that make sense? Trust me. So correct answer, central ray must be directed perpendicular to the metacarpal phalangeal joint. Well, that's what I got for tonight. I know that was a little light, but again, this was like the kind of whoever, whatever kind of craziness one. So if you got questions or if you got questions for me or whatever, you want to bounce ideas off me, you've got a mnemonic that has worked for you, please share that. Like if you've got questions, share it. Like this is a safe space. We're all here just trying to learn together. I'm literally not getting paid anything for doing this. I just enjoy talking about this stuff. So Joseph says, not sure if this helps anyone, but I've always thought about the radius being rad, and it wears a backwards cap capitulum like a I love that. And it wears a backwards cap capitulum like a cool dude. That's good. That's good. Yeah, I definitely go with the rad for, like the radius is rad. It articulates with the capitulum, the trapezium goes with the thumb, and so going down, up to the more proximal portions of the bone, I like that. That's really good, like a capitulum. Cool. Yeah, that's good for elbow anatomy. I'm going to write that one down if you don't mind. Other things, any questions or yeah, thank you. Thank you for showing up. I know folks got stuff to do and places to go. Um, capitulum, backwards cap. That's awesome. I'll remember that. Well, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop